Hi everyone, and welcome to the Handy Philosopher channel. This is part two of our Peter Singer reading, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. We'll be looking at paragraphs 5 to 13 in this section. It's a really important section from a kind of the nuts and bolts of philosophy point of view, because this is where Singer actually presents his argument. And, being a modern philosopher, he presents it in more of a I guess a logical progression style than what we've experienced with some of the others like Nietzsche or Plato or that sort of thing. Although he does Singer definitely uses a Socratic form of argument. Um, but yeah, hopefully it's relatively straightforward to follow. We'll see Singer presenting um, his sort of the core argument first, and then developing that a little bit more. Okay, so. This will be going from paragraph 5 uh, to paragraph 13 in the reader. So if you haven't already, I'd recommend numbering the paragraphs along the side. Just do be careful with page breaks and figuring out if, you know, where the next page starts. Is that a new paragraph, or is that a continuation of the paragraph from the previous page? Otherwise, it's going to throw you out. Okay. But if you remember in the last section, Singer sort of outlined what's going on. So he identified the plight of the Bengali refugees, which were an issue in the 70s when this was written. It's very comparable to, say, the Syrian refugee crisis today, or the extreme poverty and turmoil in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Uganda. So, despite the fact that the example might have changed a little bit, um, it still works perfectly logically for our world today. Um, Singer does at the end of that section, the first recording, he talked about the idea that he understands that what he's advocating would cause a significant change to the way that our morality is structured in society, and that it would cause a fundamental shift in our moral thinking. And he'll expand on that later on. But this section is for him to really outline his argument. Okay, and as you can see, well, as you will see, it's pretty compelling, hard to argue against. But we'll start with paragraphs 5 to 7. So this is where sort of the primary argument is developed, and where he deals with two possible contradictions to it. Okay. But yeah, he sort of squares them away pretty quickly. All right. So here we go. So highlighters and pens at the ready. Paragraph 5. And I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. So you can see on the slide, I've put that as premise 1 of his argument. I think most people will agree about this, although one may reach the same view by different roads. I shall not argue this point. People can hold all sorts of eccentric positions, and perhaps from some of them it would not follow that death by starvation is in itself bad. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to refute such positions, and so for brevity I will henceforth take this assumption as accepted. Those who disagree need read no further. So this first premise, suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad, Singer is taking this as accepted by everyone. He admits that there may be some people who don't accept that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Um, and he's saying, I'm not going to waste my time talking directly to those people who would refute that. The vast majority of people would agree to this first premise, and it's really only an eccentric viewpoint that would say that they don't agree with it. And so if you don't agree with the first premise, then the rest of the Singer reading is not for you. But if, as most people surely would, you do agree that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care is bad, then we can continue on. My next point is this. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. So this, you can see on the screen, is premise 2 in the argument. The most important part here is Singer's concept of comparable moral importance. In other words, what he's saying is we need to weigh what we would be sacrificing against what we would be achieving, or what we'd be protecting, maybe is a better word, and ask ourselves, well, did I sacrifice something more valuable, equally valuable, or less valuable from a moral point of view to what I actually achieved? If I sacrificed something less valuable, then I did the moral thing. I should have done this. If I sacrificed something of equal moral value, then it was up to me whether I do it or not. And it's reasonable that I don't do it, but I can choose to if I want to. This would be sort of the idea of going above and beyond morally. If I sacrifice something that is not morally equivalent, if I, where did I get up to? I've confused myself. So if I sacrifice something that is of equal moral importance, this is going above and beyond. If I sacrifice something of less moral importance, then this is what I really should have done. If I sacrifice something of greater moral importance, again, this is going above and beyond. All right, so, and that's very optional. So what we really need to ask ourselves, I've confused this much more than it needed to be, but we really need to try and weigh the moral significance of what we will be sacrificing in order to achieve our goal. So if we, forecasting what Singer's going to say, the end, goal that we are going to achieve by this action is saving lives. So I have to ask myself, is what I'm going to sacrifice to save those lives of moral significance to a life? Okay, and I think, knowing what Singer's going to say and, having discussed it in class and things like that, I'm sure you can see where he's going with this. Without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, I mean without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good, comparable in significance to the bad thing that we can prevent. This principle seems almost as uncontroversial as the last one. It requires us only to prevent what is bad and to promote what is good, and it requires this of us only when we can do it without sacrificing anything that is, from the moral point of view, comparably important. So what Singh is saying is that whilst this premise is a little bit more detailed, maybe a little bit less obvious, when you look at it, it's hard to argue against that. If I can stop something bad from happening and I'm not either doing something bad to achieve that or sacrificing something particularly valuable to do that, then of course I should do it. I could even, as far as the application of my argument to the Bengal emergency is concerned, qualify the point so as to make it, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. An application of this principle would be as follows. If I am walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. So here we've got Singer using his drowning child analogy. If you haven't watched the video on YouTube that outlines this that I talked about in the first recording, I'd recommend pausing for a moment and watching that. If you just search up The Life You Can Save, it's just a music track with words up on the screen in red and yellow. And it outlines this drowning child analogy very, very clearly. Okay, Singer is going to be making reference to it, but he's using it here to show the logic of premise 2. All right, so if it is in my power to prevent something bad from happening, for example, to prevent the drowning death of a child, and within my power, all I have to do is wade in. Yeah, I don't risk drowning at all. Say the water's coming up to my, let's say up to my armpits, for example. Um, I'm not at risk of drowning, but the child is most definitely. And so it's well within my power to prevent this bad thing from happening, uh, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. So the only thing I'd have to sacrifice are my clothes, which will get ruined by the muddy water. Um, I ought to do it. This isn't optional. There's an imperative, a moral imperative that I should be doing this. Okay. Um, the uncontroversial appearance of this principle, just stated, is deceptive. If it were acted upon, even in its qualified form, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. For the principle takes, firstly, no account of proximity or distance. It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbour's child 10 yards from me or a Bengali whose name I shall never know, 10,000 miles away. Secondly, the principle makes no distinction between cases in which I am the only person who could possibly do anything and cases in which I am just one among millions in the same position. So what Singer is pointing out here is it's the last dot point on the screen. The argument, which I've summarized on the screen for you, I did include an implied premise, which is the sacrifice required to assist people living in extreme poverty is not morally comparable to the death and suffering of these people, which is an implication that Singer's making. So this is the idea that clothes don't equate morally to the life of a child in the drowning child analogy. But if we have a look at that argument, we'll notice that there's no reference to distance in it. So the imperative for me to act doesn't change based on how close I am to the person who's in danger. And I mean that geographically. So if I'm standing on the edge of the lake watching the child, I have a moral imperative to save that child. If I'm sitting at home knowing that, refugees are dying in a refugee camp and I have the power to save them via a donation of money, then I also have a moral imperative to do that. The fact that they're really far away, the fact that I'll never actually know them, doesn't change the moral value of their life. The other one is then the number of bystanders. Or I've put it down as the number of bystanders. Singer talks about the number of people who are in the same position as me. So what Singer's addressing here is it doesn't matter if everyone else is donating to charity or if no one else is donating to charity. And if that sounds impractical, ask yourself honestly, if there were 100 people standing around the lake watching that child die and none of them were willing to go in, would you still go in? I would like to think that all of us would. Okay, I would like to think that we'd look at the people who don't help the child and say, you should have done something. You had the power, and you did nothing. You were going to watch that child drown. Well, Singer said, yeah, it's the same. Just because we're not talking about a child drowning in front of us, instead we're talking about a child starving to death, in a third world country, doesn't change our imperative to act. Okay, and so it's a hard argument to get around. um, Hopefully you're counting up all your pennies to see which charity you're going to give it to. So that's paragraphs 5 to 7. So he's given us a good outline of the argument. As I said, I've got it up on the screen there, and Singer identifies that both distance, how far away we are from the death, and also the number of other people that are around does not change our moral duty to help. Paragraphs 8 to 9 now, Singer will expand on this idea of distance and bystanders. Okay, so I do not think I need to say much in defense of the refusal to take proximity and distance into account. The fact that a person is physically near to us so that we have personal contact with him may make it more likely that we shall assist him, but this does not show that we ought to help him rather than another who happens to be further away. If we accept any principle of impartiality, universalizability, equality or whatever, we cannot discriminate against someone merely because he is far away from us or we are far away from him. So Singer's saying he gets it. We're more likely to help someone who's near us. We probably feel more empowered to help someone who's close to us. But what we have to understand is just because we're more likely to help someone who's closer to us doesn't change the moral imperative we have to help someone who's far away. Uh, and so otherwise, we're setting a moral standard where moral worth is actually determined by how close someone is to me. And this is a pretty silly way to identify moral worth. Admittedly, it is possible that we are in a better position to judge what needs to be done to help a person near to us than one far away, and perhaps also to provide the assistance we judge to be necessary. If this were the case, it would be a reason for helping those near to us first. This may once have been a justification for being more concerned with the poor in one's town than with famine victims in India. Unfortunately, for those who like to keep their moral responsibilities limited, instant communication and swift transport have changed the situation. From the moral point of view, the development of the world into a global village has made an important, though still unrecognized, difference to our moral situation. So Singer here is bringing up the fact that technological advancement has changed what we should really consider as being near to us. With the advent of the internet, everyone is near to me from the perspective of within my reach to help. And so this idea of the global village, it's no longer a simple factor that I will only help the people who are around me because I only know about them and I only know how to help them, because how could I possibly know what's going on in other parts of the world? Well, actually, we've got a pretty fair idea what's going on in other parts of the world, particularly where things are bad, and we've got a pretty easy way to help them as well. Expert observers and supervisors sent out by famine relief organizations or permanently stationed in famine-prone areas can direct our aid to a refugee in Bengal almost as effectively as we could get it to someone in our own block. There would seem, therefore, to be no possible justification for discriminating on geographical grounds. So we shouldn't be deciding to promote a local charity that is, say, helping people but not saving lives over a charity on the other side of the world which is saving lives. Okay, that sounds a bit cold-hearted, but this really comes down to the effective altruism movement, which is, a lot of what Singer focuses his work on now. If you want to do as much good as you possibly can, if you can only donate $100, make sure as much is being done with that $100 as possible. There may be a greater need to defend the second implication of my principle, that the fact that there are millions of other people in the same position in respect to the Bengali refugees as I am does not make the situation significantly different from a situation in which I am the only person who can prevent something very bad from occurring. Again, of course, I admit there is a psychological difference between the cases. One feels less guilty about doing nothing if one can point to others, similarly placed, who have also done nothing. Yet this can make no real difference to our moral obligations. So what Singer is saying here is just because there's other people not donating doesn't actually change the fact that you have a moral obligation to donate. It might help you to feel a little bit better, but that feeling is false. You are just as wrong by not donating as you are if you are the only person. Okay, so whilst you might watch the drowning child in the lake with 10 other people around and go, oh, well, none of the other 10 went in, so I didn't either. You're just as morally wrong in that decision making as you are if you are the only person watching the child drown. Okay. Should I consider that I am less obliged to pull the drowning child out of the pond if, on looking around, I see other people no further away than I am, who have also noticed the child but are doing nothing? One has only to ask this question to see the absurdity of the view that numbers lessen obligation. It is a view that is an ideal excuse for inactivity, Unfortunately, most of the major evils, poverty, overpopulation, pollution, are problems in which everyone is almost equally involved. So Singer here is really throwing down the moral gauntlet to us and saying, you might sit there and sort of say to yourself, this isn't my problem. I didn't cause this. I didn't start the war in Syria. I didn't remove the food from uh, the people. I didn't deny people basic medication. Singer's saying you might feel that way, but by purchasing things that were non-essential, you actually did. Every time you purchase something that you didn't really need, but something that you just wanted, um, then you promoted that over feeding someone or giving someone a shot to protect them from malaria infection or a whole range of other things. This is uncomfortable, but for Singer, this is the way that it is. Okay. Next section, paragraph 10 to 12, we see a couple of other objections being looked at here. The first one that we'll see in this paragraph, paragraph 10, is the idea that I should only be contributing my share. So if I could figure out somehow, well, if everybody gave up an equal amount, how much would I have to give up to solve global poverty? Which is not very much, by the way, if everyone was doing their part, just on a side note. But if that were the case, and then I say, well, I'm going to do that. Okay, I'm going to give up what is my share, and then I've done my part. And if other people don't do their part and people still die, well, that's on them. They didn't do their part. I did mine. Okay. Singer's going to suggest that this is an impractical way to look at morality, and that the conclusion that I'm only obliged to give the minimum amount is incorrect. Okay, so here we go. The view that numbers do make a difference can be made plausible if stated in this way. If everyone in circumstances like mine, so everyone in the developed world, gave £5 to the Bengal Refugee Fund, there would be enough to provide food, shelter, and medical care for the refugees. There is no reason why I should give more than anyone else in the same circumstances as I am. Therefore, I have no obligation to give more than £5. So I've actually summarized this part on the screen in standard form there. So premise one, if everyone in circumstances like mine gave £5, there would be enough to provide food, shelter, and medical care for the refugees. There is no reason that I should give more than anyone else in the same circumstances I am. We're all morally equally involved, and so I don't have to do more than anyone else. So therefore, I have no obligation to give more than £5. So Singer will continue, and keep an eye on the standard form there because he's going to be talking about the premises and that sort of thing. But each premise in this argument is true, and the argument looks sound. It may convince us unless we notice that it is based on a hypothetical premise, particularly the first one. Look, if everyone in circumstances like mine. Although the conclusion is not stated hypothetically. I have no obligation to give more than £5. The argument would be sound if the conclusion were, if everyone in circumstances like mine were to give £5, I would have no obligation to give more than £5. If the conclusion were so stated, however, it would be obvious that the argument has no bearing on a situation in which it is not the case that everyone else gave £5. This, of course, is the actual situation. It is more or less certain that not everyone in circumstances like mine will give £5. So there will not be enough to provide the needed food, shelter, and medical care. Therefore, by giving more than £5, I will prevent more suffering than I would if I gave just £5. Okay, so what Singer's saying here is this argument would work if we change the conclusion to say if everyone else was doing it, then I have no obligation to give more than £5. But that would make the argument sound. So it would then be like it would make logical sense. But what it wouldn't still be is applicable to our situation. So we know that not everyone is giving their £5. That's the reality. So the argument, if it was rewritten in the correct way with a hypothetical conclusion, wouldn't work because we don't exist in the hypothetical world where everyone in circumstances like mine is giving their share. So Singer is basically saying it doesn't work that way. Okay, you can create that argument, but it has no bearing on the situation we're in. So what you need to admit is that you'll reduce more suffering if you give more than £5. It doesn't matter if other people are giving £5 or not. If you give £5, you will reduce some suffering. If you give 10, you'll reduce more. If you give 15, you'll reduce even more. Okay, that your equal share is only £5 is irrelevant unless everyone else is doing their part. If they're not, then it doesn't matter what your equal share is. It might be thought that this argument has an absurd consequence. Since the situation appears to be that very few people are likely to give substantial amounts, it follows that I and everyone else in similar circumstances ought to give as much as possible. That is, at least up to the point at which by giving more one would begin to cause serious suffering for oneself and one's dependents, perhaps even beyond this point to the point of marginal utility, at which by giving more one would cause oneself and one's dependents as much suffering as would be prevented in Bengal. So Singer's saying the logical extreme of this, if we really took it, is, well, we should be giving absolutely everything we can until we reach marginal or comparable suffering. So I should give up as much pay as I can to support, say, the Syrian refugees today, to the point where my life is as bad as a Syrian refugee. And as soon as I gave more money, my life would actually be worse, because then the refugee would be obliged to help me. So it would sort of counterbalance. So this is a very extreme view. And we could call it giving to the point of comparable suffering. This is an issue, but Singer's going to show why we don't actually need to give to the point of comparable suffering. So yeah, if everyone does this, however, there will be more than can be used for the benefit of the refugees, and some of the sacrifice will have been unnecessary. Thus, if everyone does what he ought to do, the result will not be as good as it would be if everyone did a little less than he ought to do, or if only some do all that they ought to do. So if everyone did that, so if everyone gave up to the point of comparable suffering, then there would be actually much more than could possibly be used to support the Syrian refugees. In our case, the Bengali refugees in Singers. This would be a flood of money that couldn't be used. Okay, this will be a little bit clearer in this next paragraph, although there's some tricky sentences in it. But on the screen, I've got Singer points out that the charity would need to be simultaneous and unexpected for it to work this way. So in reality, this is not how charity works. What I can do is I can say, well, I've got $1,000 that I was going to spend on something that I want but don't need. I will now donate that $1,000 to the Syrian Refugee Fund. In a month's time, I might have saved up another $1,000. And I can look at the Syrian Refugee Fund and go, do they still need more? Is the problem solved? Are people still living in extreme poverty? Yes. Okay, well, they can have that $1,000 too. I will, in this way, continue this until the problem is actually solved. I don't have to give up everything in my life and reduce my life down to the level of a Syrian refugee to then donate all of that in one go. Because the problem with this is it suggests that I need to try and solve the problem immediately. I don't necessarily need to try and solve the problem immediately. I need to try and solve the problem as effectively as I possibly can. So I'm well within my rights to expect that at least some people will also want to help. Okay, so if everyone gave everything they had, then there'd be a flood of money. So, well, let's not do that because there will be some other people who help. I'll give what I can right now, and other people will give what they can right now. Then let's see the impact that had. Is the problem still there? Yes, it is. Okay. Well, I'll give now what I've got as well. Okay. I'll give more, and other people will give more. And let's look at it. Okay. So this is, the idea of, for the issue that Singer's identifying here, that is that donations would need to be simultaneous and unexpected. Um, but we can monitor the situation to see how it's going. Okay, so uh, paragraph 12 here. The paradox arises only if we assume that the actions in question, sending money to the relief funds, are performed more or less simultaneously and are also unexpected. For if it is to be expected that everyone is going to contribute something, then clearly each is not obliged to give as much as he would have been obliged to had others been giving too. And if everyone is not acting more or less simultaneously, then those giving later will know how much more is needed and will have no obligation to give more than is necessary to reach this amount. To say this is not to deny the principle that people in the same circumstances have the same obligations, but to point out that the fact that others have given or may be expected to give is a relevant circumstance. Those giving after it has been known that many others are giving, and those giving before are not in the same circumstances. So the seemingly absurd consequence of the principle I have put forward can occur only if people are in error about the actual circumstances. That is, if they think they are giving when others are not. But in fact, they are giving when others are. The result of everyone doing what he really ought to do cannot be worse than the result of everyone doing less than he ought to do, although the result of everyone doing what he reasonably believes he ought to do could be. Okay, so Singer here is avoiding this paradox of excess giving by suggesting that when I do donate to charity, I can assume that other people are going to donate as well. So let's go back to the £5 idea. Okay, well, my equal share to save the Bengali refugees is £5. So I'm a moral person. I'm going to do my part. Okay, I'll go and donate my £5. I'll then check in. Oh, how's the Bengali refugee crisis going? What? Everyone didn't give their £5? Everyone didn't do their part? Well, that's a shame. There are still people suffering and dying, and I have excess funds, so I'm still going to give more. So now I'll give maybe £100 to cover the difference. I look at it again. Have other people started to donate? Have they not? Can I afford to give more? If the answer is yes, and people are still suffering, then yes. So I can assume I can give people a chance to do the right thing. I don't have to, reduce my life down to the point of living as a refugee. But I do need to monitor the situation. I can't donate my £5 and go, I did my part. The problem now must be solved. Okay? Because all I was obliged to do was donate £5. Right? We can't do that. So hopefully that makes it clear of how Singer's getting around this issue. And finally, paragraph 13. This is sort of a summary paragraph of what's come before, so it's a handy one. But if my argument so far has been sound, neither our distance from a preventable evil nor the number of other people who, in respect to that evil, are in the same situation as we are, lessens our obligation to mitigate or prevent that evil. I shall therefore take as established the principle I asserted earlier. As I have already said, I need to assert it only in its qualified form. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything else morally significant, we ought morally to do it. Okay, so Singer is saying that this discussion that we've had in this section, none of it has shown that the argument he presented earlier is not sound. So it is true and it's cogent. And so therefore the assertion that he had, which we ought to help, still stands. And he's going to, in the next recording, we'll see he takes that as given and then progresses forward from that. Okay. Hopefully that was clear. Let me know if you've got any questions, but otherwise, have a great day. See you next time. Bye.